Blog Talk Radio.
The cycle of tyranny, from liberty to complacency, from complacency to dependency, from dependency to tyranny, from tyranny to revolution, from revolution back to liberty. Welcome, callers, to Lori's Talk News Radio. This is July the 17th, 2012. Hope everybody's in good spirits. So, last week I went over some rather lengthy, somewhat boring history. Sorry, I wish there was a more exciting way around that. But it's things that we really need to understand. And by the way, caller, just so you know, Teresa, that I believe that's you. You are on the air. I just went ahead and opened your mic, so you'll be live.
Hello, Lori.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good.
Good.
So yeah, last week we kind of went over some history. I touched a little bit on the Revolutionary War, brought us up to the Civil War, and kind of got into some of what happened there that's not exactly in the main text history books, as far as the Congress adjourning, Sin I Die, and all this kind of thing. And basically, we lost our republic at that time. And so what happened, I made the statement, and it's a bold statement, that we lost our republic at that time, and that since that time, we've effectively had two governments functioning within what we call the United States ever since then. And I remember the first time I heard that, I'm like, this has got to be gibberish. This just cannot be. So I brought up Downes V Bidwell. That's one of the cases, one of the main ones quoted for the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court case. Specifically, for those of you who are sticklers for detail, it's Downes V Bidwell, 182 U.S. 244, and that was in 1901. And if any of you looked that up, it was, they're kind of lengthy. I don't know how many people actually read this stuff, probably not many, I expect, but when a court gives its ruling, it gives the ruling, and then generally what happens is they'll have opinions. If they're divided, they'll have, dissenting opinions, and the what they call the majority opinion, and then a dissenting opinion. Well, in this case, one of the opinions was written by Justice John Marshall Harlan. And if you go look that case up, you'll find right in there where he said very clearly that there indeed are two parallel governments that are running within this country. And that brings me to another fun little legal definition that I'd like to bring up at this point, and that's two terms called de facto and de jure. Now, I'm looking right now at Black's Law Dictionary. This particular one is revised 4th edition. It gives pages, again, for those that are sticklers for detail, pages 824 and 825 in that particular version. And I'll just read a brief summary. There's a lot more, but I'm not going to read all of that. It says government de facto, a government of fact, a government actually exercising power and control in the state as opposed to the true and lawful government, a government not established according to the constitution of the state or not lawfully entitled to recognition or supremacy, but which has nevertheless supplanted or displaced the government de jure, which we'll get to that in a moment. A government deemed unlawful and deemed wrongful or unjust, which nevertheless receives presently habitual obedience from the bulk of the community. So that's de facto, by fact. Then you have this government de jure, a government of right, the true and lawful government, a government established according to the Constitution of the state and lawfully entitled to recognition and supremacy and the administration of the state, but which is actually cut off from power or control. A government deemed lawful or deemed rightful or just, which nevertheless has been supplanted or displaced. That is to say, which receives not presently, although it received formerly, habitual obedience from the bulk of the community. And that may sound like kind of a mouthful there, but basically it really is describing what happened here in this country at this time right after the Civil War. And that's why I make this bold assertion that we lost our republic at that time. Because that's really what's happened. And as I said, Downes V Bidwell, boy, it's hard to get that out. Downes V Bidwell, one of the best cited ones. There's others. I didn't write down a bunch of them, but there's references in that case if you're actually interested to find those. And it references other cases where they say the same thing, that there's effectively two governments functioning within the United States. And it further states in there that one of these governments, what I just read out of Black's Law Dictionary, would be the de jure, the lawful government, that functions within the Constitution, and then one that functions outside the Constitution, which would be the de facto. And this is where this whole rub comes from, and obviously this has been going on since many of us today have been alive. And it's been added to and amended, which I'll get into here in a little bit. But with that, do we have any questions there? Tracy, you got anything, thoughts, to add, or questions?
This is Teresa. Lori, hello again.
Hello.
Could you talk a little bit more about how the Revolutionary War made this change in getting the two different types of government? And then maybe could you go into a little more detail about what exactly the de jure does, and maybe stuff about them, where they're located, or how big, or, sort of statistical things, if you have that information.
Okay, sure. I guess maybe I could have and should have done a better recap on last week. My memory's fading more and more, but I guess that's just the natural order of things. Yeah, when we had the Civil War, we're taught in school mainly that was a war over slavery, and that's all we're told, and that was one of the issues. But the main issue was, and I guess I'll have to back up a little bit. I'll just have to recap this because it's important to get this whole chain of events. During the Revolutionary War, we actually borrowed money from foreign countries, most notably France. A lot of Americans don't like French, but bottom line is we probably never would have existed as a country without the money that we borrowed from the French. And they didn't loan it to us because they liked us. They loaned it to us because they hated King George because he was a tyrant. And they thought, well, we'll let them shed their blood. We'll just give them money for cannons and muskets and whatnot. So after the Revolutionary War, we were bankrupt. And you can go back and find the documents. I don't happen to have those pulled up at this moment. And in international bankruptcies, they're renegotiated every 70 years. And that's important to understand that, because when you start looking at these 70-year chunks you find that there's major happenings in this country right at those times. So if you then go to the Civil War, this was the first 70-year period where that bankruptcy had to be renegotiated. And the North, as we are told from our history books, was better developed as far as, railroads and things like that. They were just better put together. So it was kind of they had to put up collateral to reorganize this bankruptcy. And effectively what they wanted to do is they wanted to collateralize the South's properties. And the South said, no, we don't think that's quite right. And that really is a lot of what started that war. Now, the slavery thing was a real issue. But slavery was on its way out anyway. If you get into historical records, it was on its way out. there were states in the North that still had slaves. I mean, it was an issue, but that was not the main issue. So anyway, so they fought over this. And this is when President Lincoln had put out what is called Field Order 100. It's the first, what we call executive orders today, and it's called field order because it's a martial law. That's what executive orders are. They're martial law orders. And he put this out to try because he did not want to lose the republic that was there. He basically temporarily suspended the republic and the Constitution because of this civil war that was going on. And he had intentions of undoing that, rescinding that, which has a lot to do with why he was killed, actually. But nonetheless, so what happened is when they went to do the called today the Reconstruction Acts and that Reconstruction period, there was a lot of battles going on. General Grant, who later became a president, was one of them. And effectively, the Congress that they held, they adjourned that the last in 1861? 61. Yes, it had been 1861, I believe, if I'm adding my math right here. The Congress, the last truly republic form, de jure form of the Republic Congress was adjourned, what they call sine die. It's a Latin word, a couple of words, means without day. And they were basically forced out at gunpoint, bayonet. And that has remained that way to this day. So at that point, we went from a de jure republic form of government to a military rule of government. And when you ask about size, the size for intent purposes here is not really the important thing. The point is, those chairs were vacated. They've never been, well, till recently, but that's another matter, here in about the last year. Those chairs have sat this whole time unoccupied. And I believe I touched in on it last week in 1871, the incorporation of the United States and that type of thing. And at that point, the government actually became a corporation, and they function as a corporation. You can find their incorporation, they call them articles of incorporation. They're filed in the state of Delaware in 1871. It's called the Organic Act of 1871. You can look that up. And it actually names a president as just like any other corporation. They have a president, they have a board of directors, which in this case happens to be what we call Congress. And they were very much limited to the District of Columbia. If you look in the Constitution, there's reference there, this District of Columbia not to exceed 10 square miles, and says that they have total jurisdiction to make whatever laws, and on it goes. You can look in the Constitution. But that was the extent of their jurisdiction. But over time, they have convinced people that their jurisdiction extends outside of there. And since then, the other states have been incorporated, and that's why you end up with, like, for example, California. You'll have California State, the state of California. A lot of people use those interchangeably, and they think they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. One is what people think of as the United States or the land there, and the other one is actually a corporation, and they function in that manner. So I don't know if that helped to clear that up for you, Teresa, or if it made it more muddied.
I thought it was very interesting. I was actually taking a few notes.
Okay, good.
I did have another question. So the du jour was in order at the time, and then you said it was taken over, taken over by, but I didn't catch by who. Was it a certain group? Was it a certain state? Was it what, the union?
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, yeah, good question. Yeah, so when the de jure, and now you know what those words are, I'll go ahead and use that. When the de jure government, the republic that we were given by the founders, when they were forced out of Congress, sine die, without day, because basically what happened is the Constitution in the republic was put on hold during the Civil War. I mean, civil wars are a little different than one nation fighting another nation. It's internal. So President Lincoln did this Field Order 100, again, that we today call executive order, which temporarily suspended the de jure form of government and placed us under martial law. And before he could undo that, he was shot. And we've been in that state of martial law ever since. And as you'll see as we go on, I don't know if we'll get into it today or if it'll be next week, but you'll see how these things are tied into, again, remember that 70 years? When you fast forward again to 1931-ish, what do we have then? We had the Depression, 1929, and then we had the new, what I like to call the new raw deal with Roosevelt, and we went off the gold standard. People were told turn in their gold and all this kind of thing. And these all tie in, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So that's how it happened is that de jure government was suspended for the Civil War, and it was never, the martial law was never rescinded, and so we've been under that de facto martial law form of government ever since. Now, again, I know that sounds far-fetched, but when you start really delving into some of these documents, lo and behold, you find it is there. And when you see them, it's not like the people in the government I'm quoting have forgotten about it, because when you start looking at their legislation, you find they start adding on to that fact. So was that a little better?
Yes, that was very interesting.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's just there's a lot here, and this is where I it kind of stinks, and I almost wish I'd ended up picking, like, you know, an entertainment show or a music show or something. I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty dry, but it does affect. In fact, that's one of the things I wanted to get to. I had somebody who shall remain nameless to this point. Hopefully he's either on or will call in or listen later. And he's familiar with some of these things. He's heard some of these things and looked into some of it. But his question is how does all this pragmatically affect me? So I'd like to jump gears there a little bit and try to bring that up into today and how these things do affect us. Because, yeah, if it doesn't affect us, it's a lot of nice trivia, I suppose, but it's kind of a lot of long, drawn-out, dried, boring history, mumbo-jumbo if it doesn't affect us. Well, a lot of things are going on in this country, and I think most people would agree with that. They may not have their finger put on it, but when they can start telling you things like, you have to take vaccinations, or when a federal judge says you have no inherent right to determine what foods you eat, these things just sound, whoa, wait a minute, we're told this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. How can they tell us that? Well, this gets into right where I was leading up to with the martial law. So we're actually not free, we're under martial law. Then we get in this Roosevelt era, you start finding out that we were collateralized. They collateralized the land of the South, well, and in the North ultimately, but they were going to do just the South to refinance that bankruptcy. But 70 years later, it came due again, and they'd already collateralized the land, and so now they had to collateralize us. And if you look into history, you will find that people born before roughly 1933, that they did not have birth certificates. There were records kept locally in a little book, and people kept them in their Bible. but they do not have what we call birth certificates today. And this is a kind of another whole tangent that we'll eventually get into. I'll just throw this much of it out. Those birth certificates are actually bonded, and they are actually sold on the international market, and we are no more than chattel property. And this is why they can tell us that you take vaccines, you wear seat belts, you don't have a right to determine what you eat or drink. We're going to give you GMOs without telling you what it is, and you can't have raw milk. This is where these things come from. So did I just weird you out on that? Did I jump too fast, too slow there?
No, I would say that was just fine. Writing some more notes.
Oh, good. That's the only thing better than that's the sound of Bible pages flipping. So I'm glad to hear you saying that. And yeah, it's bizarre. In fact, since I've got a few minutes, we're kind of on this. I guess one of the things I probably should have done. This is only the second show, and I kind of touched on it. Kind of how I got into this. I mean, I heard some of this, years back. You hear somebody make this really weird comment about that, two governments? What are you talking about? I had one guy once, he made a comment to me. He says, I've got millions of dollars, but I have no control over it. I just wrote him off as a lunatic. I still partially think he's a lunatic, but I believe I now understand where he's coming from, and it goes back to this birth certificate. But anyway, that's kind of what got me into this, is I'm like, that can't be. But people would mention documents, which is what I'm trying to do here, and hopefully people will look into some of these. And when you start seeing congressional record documents, Supreme Court rulings, and that type of thing, source documents, you kind of have to go, well, gee, there is something here, And then when you go, well, maybe I'm not reading it right. So you start tracing down further into this bunny hole, this rabbit hole, as they call it, and you start finding out pretty quick there's some merit to it. It just sounds outlandish because we can't hardly believe it. So that's what got me into this. And then when you start to realize this, a lot of these things that we hear today about, oh, you have to have health care. Oh, you, again, with the seat belts, or you can't do drugs, and this kind of thing. That was never, ever done. Again, you look at pre-1938, before the FDA, Food and Drug Administration came in. You could go down to your local drugstore, and you could buy penicillin, you could buy cocaine, you could buy opiates, you could buy dynamite at that time. Today, none of it. You have to go see the man in the white coat with a stethoscope around his neck, or her neck, as the case may be. And that's because they have slowly been adding on to these things a little bit at a time. And so it does affect us. But this is kind of the beginning, the bankruptcy there, Civil or Revolutionary War, martial law in the Civil War, and then we went off the gold standard. And one of the things I was actually going to get into, also I'll just mention them for, you or somebody else listening wants to start looking some of these up. We had a couple of other things. Trading with the Enemies Act of 1917. That was put into place for what it sounds like, trading with the enemies in World War I. There was some gold going on. I'm not going to get into a bunch of details. But then in 1933, Roosevelt made an interesting thing. He's got one. It's called the War and Emergency Powers Act. A lot of people just call it, the War Powers Act. They condensed it that way. In 1933, it was an interesting little addition put into the 1917 Trading with the Enemies Act. We'll get into that at next week or something perhaps. But all these things, that's how law works, and that's something I found out as I looked into this. These laws, they don't just make a law and it sits there by itself. They add on to them. They piggyback on. And that's why when you look at it, and I know you're familiar with this, Teresa, the financial stuff, you go to do taxes, so yada, 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 see circular E or whatever it is. Law does the same thing. It says, pursuant to blah, 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 and it'll mention some other section or code or something somewhere. somewhere else, so you have to go read that. And that's what they do. They kind of make this confounded thing that most people, 2 minutes, and you have to, fine, whatever. And that's how they do it. So did I jump tracks on you there again, Teresa?
No, that was very interesting again.
Okay, well, I say I'm just trying. Do you have any thoughts or idea how I might be able to present this type of information and maybe make it a little more lively?
I think you're doing really excellent.
Okay, well, it's just, I was kind of afraid. It's just, and the other thing got me in this too is there are a lot of people coming up with blogs, blog talk radios, starting their own website, and this particular narrow band of information almost invariably seems to be missing. They understand all this helter-skelter and what's going on and how can they do these things, but they don't quite seem to grasp this part for some reason. There's people out there that know about it. You can find websites and videos and that type of thing on this, which really is kind of how I got started, but it's something that's almost kind of hidden, and I guess if you're going to do some corrupt stuff, why, you wouldn't probably want to publicize it, would you? So do you have any other questions there?
Let me look at my notes here. Oh, you were talking about how, I believe it was in the 30s or something, maybe earlier, that you could go into a store and buy various narcotics. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, any thought of how drug addiction was, I'm assuming, less during that time, as well as generally who took that off the shelves, so to speak?
Right. Well, and I'm going to have to make this quick. We got about 2.5 minutes. As I mentioned, that was the FDA, Food and Drug Administration Act, was created in 1938, and that's when that stopped. They started regulating that. You have to understand, when this country started, we were a republic, and we were all sovereign citizens. Now, I know that term gets a bad rap today, and they make it sound like Dad and Junior are going to hop out of a car and mow people down with AK-47s. And yeah, there's those type of people out there. But this is why, have you ever seen old westerns where you see these two guys shooting it out, and one guy shoots the other one, and the sheriff's standing right there and nobody goes to jail? You ever seen that, Teresa?
Yes, I have.
Well, that used to happen because back then a sovereign can declare war on another. I mean, it's like two kings. That's why we have these expressions that a man's home's his castle. We even today have the castle doctrine. So you could do that. But the point is, we were able to buy these types of things, and in response to what you said about with drug addiction, so it was almost non-existent. It's just like the same thing happened when they did prohibition. It was almost non-existent. And these are all money-generating and corruption-generating things we'll get into next week. Unfortunately, we're down to about a minute, and if I'm talking and I stop, it's because I'm still not used to this. I don't know if you hear it or not, but this thing kicks in and tells me I have 90 seconds, and it kind of for a minute I'm stumped.
Oh, yeah,
so
no, it's killing you, I'm sure.
Yeah, so anyway, there's about 1 minute left, so I hope I got that answered for you, and if you can come back next week, I'd appreciate it, and we can pick that up. Just keep those notes handy, and I'll try to answer some of those and go over from there. And then, this next week we'll just recap on what we touched here. And you or anybody else has any questions, I'll sure try to answer them the best I can. So thank you.
Next week.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa, for joining in. Lori's Talk News Radio. Be here the same time next week. Same channel, as they say, same bat time, same bat channel. And we'll go ahead and go for it. So, all right, you guys have a good evening, and We'll talk with you later.